Lighthouses from earliest times have fascinated and intrigued members of the human race. To almost every man and woman there is something about a lighted beacon which suggests hope and trust. Standing off by itself in the ocean, a lighthouse symbolizes the eternal vigilance of its keeper, who must be alert and watchful at all times, in sunshine or darkness, in fog or stormy weather.
Edward Rowe Snow first came under the spell of lighthouses long before he wrote those words from famous lighthouses of New England. As a small boy, he traveled up the coast by steamship from his Winthrop, Massachusetts home to Rockland, Maine with his family, passing many of the lighthouses of Boston Harbor and the Maine coast. As a teenager, Snow visited the lighthouses of Boston Harbor by canoe. Boston Light made an especially strong impression, as he wrote in Famous Lighthouses in 1944.
Ever since the first time I visited Boston Light, America's oldest beacon, it has remained in my mind as the ideal American lighthouse. No beacon anywhere that I know of has just that pleasing combination of insular isolation, attractive surroundings, and rugged grandeur of which Boston Light can boast.
Maurice Babcock of the United States Lighthouse Service was the keeper of Boston Light from 1926 to 1941, when the Coast Guard took over the light, as they did all lighthouses beginning in 1939. His son, Maurice Jr., grew up at the lighthouse on Little Brewster Island.
Lighthouses still have a sentimental value to people, whether they come from the Midwest or whether they grew up or live on the coast and have seen one. People just love lighthouses, and I guess it's part of their genes, you know. The first settlers, the immigration to this country, one of the first things that the immigrants would see would be some landmark or some lighthouse or a Nantucket lightship. And that's the United States. That's the land of freedom. And it's amazing to understand lighthouses. The idea of the lighthouse, that the ray up and down the entire coast of the United States, both east and west and the southern coast, was that the rays of the lighthouses would intertwine. And never along the coast would there be any place that you'd be out of sight of a light or a landmark of a lighthouse. And they achieved that purpose over many, many years.
The other lighthouses of Boston Harbor each had their special appeal to young Edward Rowe Snow as well. Long Island Head Light, Graves Light, Deer Island Light, and Minot's Light, which Snow called America's most dangerous beacon, all became vital points of research for his first book, The Islands of Boston Harbor, published in 1935. Snow and his wife, Anna Merle, learned firsthand of the vigilance of lighthouse keepers when Maurice Babcock helped them pull their canoe ashore at Little Brewster Island in a squall. A friend of Snow's in Winthrop, pilot Bill Winkapaw, had his own reasons to be grateful to lighthouses and their keepers. It was the gleam of Dice Head Light near Rockland, Maine, that guided Winkapaw and his light cargo plane to safety in a blinding snowstorm a few days before Christmas in 1927. Deeply thankful, Winkapaw flew back over the light a couple of days later and dropped wrapped presents to the keepers. The appreciation they showed Winkapaw convinced him to expand the present-dropping flight to a few more lighthouses the following year. With La Touraine Coffee Company as his sponsor, Winkapaw was flying over 117 lighthouses by Christmas of 1935. Edward Rowe Snow was teaching high school in Winthrop at that time. His wife, Anna Merle, remembers how his involvement began.
Well, Edward, being extremely interested in lighthouses, thought that he would like to go with him sometime. So one time he did go with Captain Winkapaw when he went to the Flying Santa trip. And then when Captain Winkapaw went to fly gold over the Andes Mountains and was to be away, Edward took over from him and he we made up the packages, and he dropped them to a few lighthouses.
Snow was not sponsored as Winkapaw had been, and since he was not a pilot, Snow had to hire a plane and pilot each year. Donations of gifts and money helped, and the trips had their rewards, as Anna Merle explained at George's Island on the annual Edward Rowe Snow Memorial Day in 1987.
What type of presents did you bring in?
Books, candy, pen and pencil set, believe it or not, dark glasses. Somebody, a friend of Mr. Snow's, gave him some dark glasses to send in the packages. And they were, each individual present was wrapped in newspaper because they dropped from an airplane, you see. They dropped from an airplane. He went twice by helicopter, but the other time he went by regular plane, Cessna or Piper or whatever it happened to be. He did not own the plane, he hired it, and we used to say we could have had a very fancy home if we had used the money in other ways, but think of how much more fun it was to give it to the people of the lighthouses, to see them coming out. When you're in the plane, you see them coming out. He would go around the lighthouse first and let them know he was coming, and then he would drop a package. He'd look out and see if they got it. He'd go around again and drop another package. And it was so much fun, such satisfaction.
Maurice Babcock Jr. remembers flying Santa in the 30s.
Oh, I can remember getting the presents, right. I can remember them landing on the ledges out in the back and getting them when the tide went out, all soaking wet. But as I remember, we used to get papers, magazines. There may have been these comic books in them, I can't remember. Tootsie Rolls, chewing gum, Christmas candy, which was pulverized. But there was always the excitement of going out and getting the package that dropped, whether it hit the water or hit the ledges, and I don't think he really wanted to drop it in the middle of the island, because he could have put it right through one of the houses, so he tried to drop it along the edges, and but it was exciting. It was a recognition that we were out there.
In this 1967 radio program, Snow explained to Alan Derry his method of dropping packages.
Can you briefly tell us how it works? How do you drop these packages? How high do you fly over the lighthouse?
As close as possible to the ground. Why? So that the wind won't catch the package. A lot of people think I do it by parachute, but truthfully, I haven't money enough to pay for all of those parachutes. They would cost about $5 each, while I can get 3 cents worth of other material.
What's your batting average?
92% over 31 years it will be in
that's
December.
Pretty good.
Yes.
At Ipswich one time, they were having a party, and they were all there so that they could wave at the flying Santa when he went over. And somebody said, "Has he come yet?" And the wife, there was a crash, and the wife said, yes, it had come through the skylight, and it was right there at the party.
Larry Baum is the current Coast Guard keeper at Fort Point Light in Stockton Springs, Maine.
He's also gotten some windshields. I talked to Russ Algren, who was the last keeper down at Cape Nettic, down at the Nubble Light. They got Russ's windshield one year. First year he was there. And it was real nice. They reimbursed him for his windshield, and he got to keep the package. You know, I thought that was very fair.
Another time at Eastern Point Light, he went over and they could not find the package. Edward had been there and he had dropped it, but it apparently had gone into a little area where there were trees, and it wasn't until, I think they said it was July or August, that the dog went out and found the package and brought it back.
Joe Kolb, a friend of the Snows, flew with them one year.
I was amazed at the method that he used. He just basically opened the window and threw the package out. he explained that he no longer wore the beard in his flying Santa runs because during one of the times that he opened the window to drop the package out, so went the beard.
Dorothy, the Snows' only child, was born in 1951, shortly after the family moved from Winthrop to Marshfield. She made her first flying Santa flight when she was less than 1 year old and was on every one until her marriage.
There was one time where there were storms on 3 sides of us, and it was really, there was snowstorms, and it was very dangerous. And yeah, I mean, you do that with your father. You always figure that everything's going to be all right. He knows what he's talking about. But sometimes afterwards he'd show that he had been a little scared too, or he'd tell me about it.
The Snows flew in storms several times. One year making an emergency landing at Portland Airport in a blizzard after the plane lost its heater. The flights were demanding, but they were thrilling too, as Snow wrote in 1955 in famous Lighthouses of America.
I wish I had the power to give each of you the sensation of flying along in the plane with us, in that detached world which forever will belong to the airmen. The moment you have taken off and watched the earth drop away from you, it is a far different existence than on land. I speak not of the palatial airliners with their sumptuous trappings and ease of takeoffs and landings, but rather of the type of plane necessary to drop the Christmas bundles on tiny islands and lighthouses far at sea.
The most time-consuming work took place in the weeks leading to Christmas.
When it was flying Santa time, we would, the ping pong table in the cellar would no longer be a ping pong table. It would have different stations at each place, because in the packages there were, I remember this from before, at one time cigars and cigarettes before people knew that they were bad for you, even though my mother always knew. But people had people had donated them. Cigars, cigarettes, chewing gum, pens and pencils, sunglasses, razor blades, balloons, candy, a doll, if it was, if they had a child there or whatever. And each thing was wrapped individually in newspaper. And then after the newspaper, they had something called Excelsior, which is like hay that they'd wrap everything else in. And then around all that was brown wrapping paper. And we'd have different stations at the ping pong table. People would wrap the sunglasses and wrap this and that. And my father would usually be the one who wrapped it in the brown paper. And people will have made string, and he had it in a bowline knot that he'd tie the right way. And then he'd put S for stag if there were no children there, and D for doll if there was a doll in there. And then early in the morning, we'd go up to Norwood Airport and fill the car. I remember the station wagon being absolutely chock-a-block full with all these packages, and me not really wanting to go because I knew it would be so rough. But we tried Dramamine, we tried not using Dramamine, we tried eating breakfast or not eating breakfast or whatever. And we'd get to Norwood and start packing the plane and try and pack it so that there were packages that were the right number of dolls and stags and different ones for the right people. And so that when he needed a certain package, he'd be able to have it at his fingertips.
There were about 40 lighthouses that received yearly visits from the Flying Santa, but snow often extended the flights.
At one time, he went to St. Pierre and Miquelon, which is way up above Nova Scotia, I believe, or near there. And then he flew to Florida one year. And another time, we went to New York. He dropped some packages there. Afterwards, he dropped packages for the same day after we had flown across the country. He dropped them in California. So that was quite a day. But usually it was between Maine and Block Island.
Snow's visit to the French-owned island of St. Pierre became the subject of one of his columns in the Quincy Patriot Ledger.
Children soon flocked around my aircraft. I was wearing my flying Santa suit, and as the children walked slowly up to the plane, I gave each a Christmas present. It was a strange experience for me, for the children seemed so solemn. Hoping to break the ice, I decided to throw an entire package of candy over the heads of the youngsters. Such a squealing and shouting there was as the young folk attempted to retrieve the candy. It was only then that I realized that I was the first Santa ever to visit this lonely isle.
But the greatest rewards came from the reactions of the keepers and their families.
I think it was one of the first times that Edward and I went over 10-pound island light, that the keeper's wife, when she knew he was coming, went out with newspapers and nails, and she nailed down a greeting to him, "Merry Christmas." Well, Edward, when we went over it, Edward and I were fascinated, and Edward took pictures of it. So the next morning, he had the pictures developed and he had taken them to the paper, the newspaper, and it came out in the paper that day. The boy from 10-Pound Island Light was at school that day, so when he came back from school, he had bought one of the papers and took it out to his mother, and the mother was very thrilled about it. The keeper said, I didn't think that would come out.
Many people spelled out greetings to Flying Santa over the years, using pine boughs, driftwood, stones, or whatever was available. People showed their appreciation in other ways, too, such as the young bride at Gurnet Light near Plymouth.
This keeper had just been married, and he and his wife were living at the light at Christmas time. Well, it's very lonely out there because it's difficult to go along the beach and get into Duxbury. So when the plane went over, she was all excited, and she ran out, and we saw her feet going just as fast as they could to pick up the bundle. And later she wrote and said that she was delighted. She felt much more at home now that they had been welcomed so nicely at the Gurnet.
The Flying Santa was a great event and a tradition, and you know, it was perfect. It was the best thing for morale you could imagine on the stag stations. It was even better on the family stations because most of the family stations were on offshore islands. To have the traditional Flying Santa Claus come by and stop and drop them something for them that was from Santa Claus, and to be able to see him in the airplane or see him when they stopped with the helicopters was probably the best thing for morale. It carried you through the whole year.
Malcolm Rouse is the keeper at Owl's Head Light in Maine.
Oh, Christmas comes, and the guys that were married and had kids, they want to be home. Or even the single guys. It's, you know, everyone will want to be, last place they want to be is that lighthouse. And look up and see this plane flying around and someone thinking of them, dropping presents like that, like Edward Rowe Snow did. I'm sure brought countless moments of joy to a lot of Coast Guard personnel that, you know, they wouldn't have had a Christmas if it wasn't for him.
One year, Snow received a letter from 5-year-old Seamond Ponsart, the daughter of the keeper at Cutty Hunk Light in the Elizabeth Islands, requesting a doll for Christmas. Snow was happy to oblige.
But when the package landed, it broke the doll, and she was absolutely heartbroken. So they wrote to Mr. Snow, and he said, that will never do. So he, the next year, went with a helicopter. He had to pay for the helicopter to come all the way from Rhode Island up, and he had to pay the high expense of that as well as the rest of the trip, but of the expenses. But he didn't seem to mind, because when he landed at Gay Head, where the keeper's daughter was, he handed the doll to the little girl, and she was ecstatic. She loved the Flying Santa from that time on, and every year she would send him a letter and thank him again for making her Christmases so happy.
Snow always enclosed a self-addressed letter or card in the packages, asking the recipients to let him know that they had received their presents. This was how he measured his accuracy, and it was also a means of staying in touch with the keepers and their families. Dropping the presents was fun for Snow and the people at the lighthouses, but the method had many drawbacks.
You know, there have been times where people would write and say, "Thank you for coming, why didn't you drop anything? You know, we saw you circle, but where are the packages?" And obviously he dropped them, but they didn't see it at the right time. And at times there were packages that were found years later, where the only things that were still good were the razor blades. I mean, the books were all squished together, and the balloons were not usable, and the candy was unbelievable. But the razor blades were still good. And one year, in the ultimate ignorance of one company, they donated ribbon candy. Now, if you can imagine, it's hard to get ribbon candy that doesn't break when you carry it, let alone drop it from an airplane. So a lot of the ribbon candy was eaten at the Coast Guard stations instead of having it be dropped from the plane.
As time went on, it became more and more expensive to drop things from a plane because you had to have insurance. If someone should be hit, it would be very, very expensive without insurance. So we very often went to an airport, and the lighthouse keepers would come from a certain area, such as Rockland, Maine, and they would come to the airport there, and he would give them their presents in person.
Ken Black was the Coast Guard commander at Point Allerton in Boston Harbor, and later at Rockland Harbor, as well as the founder of the Lighthouse Museum in Rockland.
Every year, when Edward would come up with the Flying Santa, I'd meet him at Rockland Airport, and we'd have a little gay time, a little fun time with it. I'd always made sure that we had a bunch of kids, the Coast Guard kids, and Coast Guard wives, and made a fun thing of it, as I said. And we were able to, I started a little Coast Guard exchange here, so we were able to get some funds for this sort of thing. So I bought a very special Coast Guard lamp. And I said, when Edward comes this time, we'll surprise him, we'll give him a present. So, which we did, and they made a big to-do about it. And a nice Coast Guard lamp, and he was very pleased. So,
Dorothy remembers one of the last times she went on the Flying Santa trip, shortly after her marriage to John Leonard Bicknell, who was also invited along.
He was thrilled with this. He'd never been in a small plane, and he thought it was going to be wonderful. We went up in the plane, and he was so excited, and it was very, very rough. And they put me way in the back, as usual, with the packages all around me. And my dad would be in the seat directly behind the pilot. Some people thought he piloted the plane, but he never did, because he'd have to be able to throw the packages out. And he was in the seat behind the pilot, and they had made a special window every year for him that they'd put in, and they'd fold the window up, and he'd balance it on his head. And the roar of the wind would just be unbelievable, and the pressure would change. And then there would be either a photographer, or in this case, my husband was in the front, in the co-pilot seat, and then my mother would be behind that person next to my father. And this year, it was just incredibly windy. And he started to be ill, and he was ill and sicker and sicker and sicker, and finally the pilot said, "We have to stop. We have to come down." They landed at Beverly Airport, and they closed the airport as soon as we landed. And my father was livid, because here was the Flying Santa, all ready to go, but no place to go. And they left us off, someone gave us a ride home, and everything was wonderful. But it took a while for him to take off, and but he did get the rest of the things done. that day.
Another aspect of the Flying Santa visits that was important to the keepers was the inclusion of Snow's own books.
The keepers were most interested in their books, especially when the books would have lighthouse stories in them. And they often, almost most of Mr. Snow's books had at least one lighthouse story in it.
Malcolm Rouse remembers discovering Edward Rowe Snow's books.
I guess it was in the winter of 1978 when I was stationed on Menempsha down Martha's Vineyard. And I had the opportunity to read those books. And I said, well, I'm glad someone sat down and did all this research on the vessels that went down in this area on the New England coast, all the stories he had about lighthouses and the keepers and everything else, and it was fantastic.
The publicity generated through his books and the Christmas lights was appreciated by those living at the lighthouses.
He called to the attention of the general public that there was such a thing as a lighthouse service. Mariners knew it. Many mariners took it for granted until they were in trouble. The people who didn't live on the coast where they could see a lighthouse beacon or hear a horn, a foghorn, it called to their attention that this is a maritime nation, that our economy depends upon sea lanes of communications.
Larry Baum was keeper at Great Duck Island in Maine in 1980, his first year in New England, and the year Snow made his final Flying Santa trip.
We read about the Flying Santa, but didn't expect to see such a thing. So when he came in, and out he came in full dress and the whole 9 yards, and he spent about 2 hours and talked with us. And I think I probably learned more New England maritime history in 2 hours of sitting on Duck Island with the Flying Santa Claus than I have reading the books or anything since.
In 1979, Snow had predicted that children yet unborn would be voting before he'd retire as Flying Santa. But this Santa Claus was, after all, human. And in 1981, after 44 years of the Santa flights, he suffered a stroke. While he was in the hospital, Judith Weirs, founder of the Hull Life-Saving Museum, met with others involved in the museum.
And as we were talking, we were thinking about Edward Rowe Snow and thinking of a way of honoring him, because he had done with his life what we were hoping to do with the museum. In other words, focus people's attention on things that had happened here in Boston Harbor. And so, you know, first we thought of maybe a dinner or something like that. And we found out that he was very sick, that he was in the hospital, and that this was going to be the first time, the first Christmas, except for one time during World War II, that he had missed being Flying Santa and taking presents to lighthouses for almost 45 years. So through mutual friends, we contacted Mrs. Snow and asked if it would be all right to help her. And I remember going down to meet her. She just gave me the most wonderful hug. You know, she's just a very warm person. And we both felt so at home with each other. And she was delighted with the idea. Of course, at that time, you know, her main concern was her husband and visiting him in the hospital and so forth. And this was like a month. It was just before Thanksgiving, just a month before Christmas. And she was just very happy and said, sure. She was delighted that we were willing to take it on. It was a very hectic month.
Because the FAA said they couldn't fly a plane low enough to drop presents, the museum used helicopters. Ed McCabe was the museum's first Flying Santa, and most years still flies to the lighthouses of Maine. In April of 1982, Edward Rowe Snow died. Shortly thereafter, George Morgan became involved in the Flying Santa flights. He is now chairman of the program.
So I said, well, that sounds something I really like to do. I says, that was the first I knew of Edward Rowe Snow's connection to the whole museum, and yet I knew of Edward Rowe Snow. I had read his books. I've listened to him on the radio at different times. I never met the gentleman, but I can remember way back, I'm 55 years old, the old Boston Post, it must be close to Christmas, there's the picture of Ed Snow flying. It was always in the Boston Post. So that piqued my interest a bit more, and I did a little quick research on it the best I could and listened to some stories, and I really fell in love with the project. And I said, this is something, I said, this should go on to at least it's 100 years old, till all the lighthouses fall down, and maybe they will.
In his 6 years as chairman of the Santa program, Morgan has accumulated his share of stories. One year, a friend took his son's electric train down from the attic a few days before Christmas and gave it to Morgan.
Well, just so happened that year was the first year the Coast Guard was really able to identify the people that were living at the different areas by name, mother, father, children by ages and sex. We could never get that before. It was the Privacy Act. But somebody waived it for us, and happened to look down the Cape, and here was a little 5-year-old. This is, if I put that up in the attic, I says, my attic, I says, chances are it can get gone, broken. I says, make hay while the sun shines. So we packed it up and we flew down the Cape there, and when we landed, a little boy came out with the father, and we're lugging these, there was two families there. So we're lugging out 2 packages, plus I got the train set, and the father says, Santa, I'll be right back. He says, they're pulling up in a van from school. The girls saw the helicopter coming in, so we got the whole Plymouth school system. So meanwhile, I'm talking to the little boy, Jerry, and he's, Jerry, blah, 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 blah. So, what do you want for Christmas? And he's there, bug-eyed, He says, I want an electric train set. Well, I didn't fall over, but I said, well, here. And I gave it to him, and the father was there, and he hears the whole thing, and we did our stitch, and we stood there, and we talked to the kids, and we finally left. When I got back to Hull that night, my wife says to me, call this gentleman down the Cape. She says, call collect if you have to. So I called him. He says, how did you do that? He says, that kid went in the house, ripped that thing open, and he can't believe it. He says, in fact, he's going to believe until Santa Claus till he's 100.
One year, Morgan accompanied Ed McCabe to Owl's Head Light in Maine.
Little boy, little girl get out there, and Ed couldn't seem to get the little boy to come forward too much, and they're all dolled up in snowsuits, and finally the little girl looks right at the camera. She says, oh, Jeffrey, she says, Santa doesn't care if you wet yourself because you're so happy. And we have an NBC crew with us. The mother says, this is not going on national television. He says, no, man, we'll edit that out for you.
The fact that there is not just one flying Santa from the Hull Life-Saving Museum has been known to cause confusion.
I've got 3 small children, 5, 7, and 9. And from about mid-November all the way until Christmas, that's all we hear is, when's the flying Santa's coming? Is he going to come by helicopter? Who's it going to be? Is it going to look like him? When Ed McCabe took over the main section of it for the Hull Museum, we had to explain why his beard was not white. When George Morgan came up, it was easy because he had his own white beard. But the general explanation for the children was that when Ed McCabe came up was that Santa's beard didn't turn white until after Christmas. It was brown until Christmas and then white after Christmas or during Christmas. And that worked for a few times until George came up, and when George showed up with a white beard, that did it. We were shot. We had no explanation for it.
Edward Rowe Snow's books are still included in the Flying Santa packages.
My oldest child just turned 9 and has decided now that she needs to read. So she's in the middle of Shipwrecks and Pirates, one of the Shipwrecks and Pirates books. And we find her at 9:30 at night with her light on, very quietly reading this thing, and then we find her at 11 at night telling her she must go to sleep because you have to go to school in the morning.
The Hull Life-Saving Museum still keeps Anna Merle Snow involved in the flights.
Before we fly, we call her up, we ask her for her blessing, and tell her, you know, Ed's going up to Maine, I'm going to do the islands, Vin Blake or somebody's going to do Boston. And then when we get back, I make sure the other two do. I said, but when you get back to Boston, call up Mrs. Snow and tell her how your trip was.
Ever since the Coast Guard took over the lighthouse service in 1939, the lights have been gradually automated.
The present plans, as I understand it, and I'm in close contact with this sort of thing, is that Boston Light will be the very last. And that's simply because Boston Light was the very first, and it don't make sense. You lose the romance and all of that's very nice, but let's face it, one, it's economical, it's certainly to the taxpayer's advantage. I'm a taxpayer. And second, I think the thing that no one mentions is that it's a more efficient, effective utilization of personnel.
I'm getting ready to be transferred with the automation here to be transferred back into the search and rescue system and run the lifeboats on the West Coast. But it's been a nice change.
Keeping the light burning used to be a full-time task, as Maurice Babcock learned from watching his father and other keepers.
They were always on the lookout to make sure the light was burning properly. And the old lighthouses weren't electric light bulbs where you could throw a switch. If the vaporizers or the equipment had dirt get in it, and they had what they call smoke-ups, it wasn't just switching a light, it was going up there and cleaning the lens in the middle of the night and getting the light back on as quick as possible. Mm-hmm. And it's something they didn't want to happen, so they watched it real closely.
Most of this worry is gone with automation.
The way it goes, the light burns out, the secondary light will come on automatically in less than 3 seconds. And now that, during automation, that same light and same lens will be up there. But there will be a standby light, so there's going to be really two standby, one primary light and two standby. If that secondary light didn't work, that third light will kick in. And that's on a mast, and that can be seen the same distance, at the same brightness and everything as the main light. And the size of that light is a heck of a lot smaller than what we have up there now. If the power goes out, no problem. You've got backup system, batteries, good for 7 days or longer. Well, they're never going to lose power around here for 7 days or longer. Okay? So I don't think there's anything to worry about in that aspect, but on automation. The light will always shine.
But the reliance on lighthouses and foghorns is not what it once was.
The lighthouse as an aid to navigation does not exist. I mean, even the littlest pleasure boater can afford the Loran, and all the commercial vessels have all got the radar and Loran, and the NOAA's charting system is so good now that you don't have to depend on being able to go from lighthouse to lighthouse to lighthouse.
Some lighthouses, like Deer Island Light in Boston Harbor, have been replaced by smaller, easier to maintain beacons. This practice appears to be ending.
I think that there are plenty of people now who have been concerned about losing the structure. You know, the light would still be there in some way or another, but concerned about losing these historic structures that are really are part of the beauty of the coast. If they weren't, you wouldn't have so many postcards and books and calendars, you know, just on lighthouses. So I think the Coast Guard is quite aware of that, and the policy seems to be to try to retain the old lighthouses where possible and simply automate the mechanisms in them.
We're just at the beginning of the historical value. They, in the past 10 years, have just decided that they should all be landmarks. They should be kept up.
As the lighthouses have been automated, The Coast Guard has licensed individuals, towns, historical societies, and state and national parks to occupy and maintain the lighthouses and adjacent buildings.
The biggest part of the licensing procedure in big bold letters on the license says that you must keep it in a like-new historical condition.
Some lighthouses have been abandoned, and organizations like the Lighthouse Preservation Society are working to restore these lights when possible. But in most areas, there have been no problems finding potential occupants.
When I find one that is due to be licensed and they can't find a licensee, I know where I'll retire.
Some inactive lighthouses have been converted to inns, to museums like this one in Stonington, Connecticut, and even to youth hostels and elderly housing. But most lighthouses are still operating, and many still have people living at them. And the Flying Santa flights help to remind people of that.
Right now, I think that people probably think nobody's living at the lighthouses because there is a lot of press that they're being automated. And this will let people know, yes, there still are people out there.
Still, the era of the lighthouse keeper is coming to a close. Before he moved down the coast to Owl's Head Light, Malcolm Rouse was the last keeper at West Quoddy Head Light, at the easternmost point in the United States. West Quoddy Head was automated in June of 1988.
When we was leaving, one last look as we was going up the hill. And that was it. It was very sad, but in a way it was kind of like a good feeling too, because I would have felt a lot differently if the state hadn't took over the house. But, oh, I don't think a day or two goes by that we say, geez, I wish we was down in West Quoddy. Wish we was back.
1989 marks the 100th anniversary of the Coast Guard, and also the 200th anniversary of the old lighthouse service.
One lighthouse somewhere along this coast should be set up as a monument to the thousands upon thousands of both civilians and Coast Guard lighthouse keepers who have kept it. There's 2 lighthouses that I can name that should be a monument. One would be Boston Light, being the oldest lighthouse on the North American continent. The second being West Quoddy Head, being the easternmost lighthouse in the United States.
The Flying Santa program is a living memorial to lighthouse keepers and their families.
The flights that we do now going out to the lighthouses have the same meaning that they did many years ago. The people living at them now, especially as they're automated, are obviously not as involved in the day-to-day operations of the light, but they're there to make sure that the lights are safe. And in many cases, they're still in fairly isolated locations. And basically the original flight and the ones after that were to thank people who were taking care of our coast and helping people out in boats. And the people in the Coast Guard, I mean, that's what they're doing with their lives. They're helping the mariners out there. And from the thank you letters that we've gotten, the people are just as happy to know that they're appreciated, I think, than as people a long time ago were glad that somebody realized that they were doing a job and that they themselves cared a lot about other people.
And most importantly, the Flying Santa visits are still fun.
The kids get just as excited.
The Flying Santa may well continue into the next century, but it will forever be associated first with Edward Rowe Snow.
So he really was the one that perpetuated the tradition. 44 years is a long time. Right? I mean, after a while, you can't say to me that he's showboating for 44 years. He really believed in what he was doing.
It really was something, the Flying Santa. And the people, when he'd land, everybody, they always thought he was something really special, because he was.
In other ways, but think of how much more fun it was to give it to the people of the lighthouse. And it was so much fun, such satisfaction.
This should go on to at least 100 years. So all the lighthouses fall down, and maybe they will.
To join me as we say, Merry Christmas to all.
Literature. What do my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer with a little old driver so lively and quick? I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. And so we all thought we knew how Santa Claus arrives each Christmas. But as Charles Kuralt learned on the road to New England, Santa's flight takes many forms, always toward the light.
This is a story about light and about tradition. It begins in 1927 when a pilot, lost in bad weather off the coast of Maine, spotted the faint gleam of a lighthouse, turned toward the light, and taking his bearings from lighthouse to lighthouse, was saved. In gratitude, that Christmas, and on Christmases that followed, Captain Bill Winkapaw flew over each of those lighthouses and dropped off a bundle of gifts for the station keepers and their families. In 1936, New England author and historian Edward Rowe Snow took up the tradition and flew the Santa Claus flight to the lighthouses in good weather and bad for 44 years, taking his wife and daughter along to help him with the well-padded packages of toys and books and candy that he dropped at the isolated lighthouses. His daughter, Dorothy, will never forget the thrill.
You know, it would just be very windy and noisy, and you'd go along and you'd see him go right out the window like that, and then again, and then he'd say, they got it, and he'd be so excited. And my mother would say, now, Edward, don't lose your hat, come back in here.
Thank you for the things you sent down. I wish I could have seen the package fall.
Anna Merle Snow has kept all the letters from Halfway Rock and Monhegan, Cuttyhunk and Nantucket, from children in lonely places.
I saw you drop the package over Eastern Point Light, and I was the one who got it. I bet you make a lot of children happy. I am 14, and even I enjoyed it.
Mrs. Snow remembers watching the young bride of the lightkeeper at remote Gurnet Light off Plymouth.
She was out there, and it was her first year married, and she was so lonesome. And when she saw the plane coming, she ran out, and she danced up and down, and then when the package landed, you could see her feet going. She was running as fast as she could to get it, and she held it up way over her head, and you could just feel the joy that she had at that lighthouse. It really was very nice. And it made us feel good, too, you know.
What the Snows remembered all those years, and what other people, safe in cities, forgot, was that there were people out there on those islands and headlands, Coast Guardsmen and their families, alone most of the year, and alone at Christmas. Edward Rowe Snow died in 1982, but the Santa flight was too splendid a thing to die. And that is why this year, Santa came again to the lighthouses of New England, under the sponsorship of the Hull Life-Saving Museum now, and again the shouts of wild anticipation, and again the little family groups waiting on the ground for the one exciting event of winter, and the familiar figure waving from the sky. And again this year, a long way from any playmates, little children wrestling with big packages in the snow. The Santa flight started as an act of gratitude 58 Christmases ago. Nobody had to do this at first. By now, George Morgan, a Santa whose white beard is his own, finds he does have to every December.
Merry Christmas. Did you expect to see Santa Claus come up to visit you?
So an old tradition of warmth and gratitude was carried out this week in cold and stony places. Of course, it's a tradition that acts out the Christmas story of strangers carrying gifts great distances toward a light that pierces the darkness. Charles Kuralt, CBS News, on the road in New England.
And that's the CBS Evening News. For this Friday before Christmas, Dan Rather reporting from New York. We'll see you here again Monday. Good night.